Welcome to Crossing Phase, the first podcast featuring a Christian and a Muslim talking religion and politics. My name is Matt Hawkins. I'm a former policy director of the Southern Baptist Convention, and my friend John Pinna joins me on this side of the screen. He's founder and executive director of Muslims for Muslims. This Crossing Phase podcast is a joint project between Rolltop Productions, that's my thing, and John Pinna's Muslims for Muslims. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to the audio podcast wherever you get your podcasts. If you're already listening to the audio format, thank you very much for listening, and especially for downloads. Every little bit helps, and we're pleased to let you know that we're now showing our video selves on YouTube.
Here we are.
Not want that, but you can see what we look like now, and you can always turn us off and go back to the audio if we freak you out. So, John Pinna,
Matt, how you doing, bud?
I'm
all
good.
right. You were very clear on saying this is not me at the beginning of the podcast.
In case anybody's wondering who the other face is on screen here.
If I put on a baseball cap, I would challenge you that
bearded guy over here.
Listen, if I put on a baseball cap, I fit right in the South. Right in. It's just when I open my mouth, that's the problem. The second I open my mouth, that's it. So I'm in trouble. And I can't mind my own business. You know how that goes. So
I do.
I would get involved in something. So real fast, I get involved in some kind of shenanigans. You
just can't help yourself, can you?
Well, I've seen some pretty amazing stuff. I've been visiting some buddies in North Carolina and Kentucky. I don't know. What is a guy doing with 2 or 3 refrigerators in the back of a car, the back of a truck? And then he's stopping. He's not delivering them. He's stopping for something else. Stopping at a McDonald's and then hanging out in the park. I'm just like, what is this guy doing with all these refrigerators? Where's he going? So I don't know if I would be able. I spent quite a lot of time in the South, and
you're a curious guy.
You're
going to ask questions. You're just a curious guy, John. That's it.
So like I said, I could fit in until I get involved with other people's business, but I think I'd be all over it. I think I'd be all over the rumor and innuendo, and the small town business. Be like, what's this guy up to? What's he doing? Who's this over here? How come the cell phone doesn't work in this stretch of the road, but if you walk around, it works. Yeah. So I don't know. All
right, so. We wanted to talk some headlines. We did our previous video episode with our friend Sengay.
Sengay Searing, the Institute for Gilgit-Baltistan Studies. We talked about Kashmir and the craziness that's happening there right now.
Yeah. Pretty fascinating.
So that disputed area. Yeah.
Yeah, that was our first on-screen time for Crossing Phase. But this is another first because we're basically going to do our political rants, I guess, right? Our headline edition. Our headline edition, which we've done in audio content in the past, but it's the first video time that we're gonna break into the headlines and the current events and just you and me without a guest.
Yeah, we'll try to hold our own with each other and show that 2 different faith groups can chat, 2 different cultural backgrounds, North and South, can talk about the business and still walk away with friends.
Yeah. All right. So you were on the Twitters last week, and you saw one of my evangelical friends.
Yeah.
One of my, I don't know. Should we call him out by name or not?
It's up to you.
He's a head of a conservative think tank in Washington.
He's
a nice
chiefs.
guy. He's been very encouraging to me.
And I think I like him. I don't think he's a bad guy.
The crux is not so much him, but the observation that he was making on Twitter that you take issue with. So let's get into that.
It was a tweet that said, he basically said in all of his travels as an evangelical, he's never seen politics being preached at the pulpit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's complete falsehood. I mean, first of all,
it might be true to his experience.
That's an easy way to get around it. But in this era, in the Trump era, and I would even say maybe maybe before the Trump era, you could get away with saying something like that. But it's just an irresponsible and strange statement. It's like saying, all those people, all those Protestants that went to church in the South during slavery, never heard anything about slavery at the pulpit. Never heard any.
Well,
It's like saying those guys that were
that may be a
murdering.
different story.
We're talking about a national issue. Let's just
Sure.
talk the facts. So, I say what you want about Pastor Paula and Pastor Jeffers. Say what you want, but at least they're not lying. They're at the pulpit preaching, and Pastor Paul's an appointee at the White House. Evangelicals are heavily involved in politics and we're not talking about a daily basis. We're talking about heavily embedded in the governmental process, where we have an executive order to appoint religious leaders in each agency. And I'm not going to get into whether or not we should have religion involved in government, because I'm somebody who believes that there should be separation of church and state, but it's very important to understand religion. And I think most careers don't understand the nuances of different religions. So,
Right. I agree with that.
But yeah, and so I think religious
we've
training.
seen most of that. We've seen that up close.
Right.
Which is
right.
at its best, if it's functioning properly, it's a decent concept for the faith-based offices across the federal administrations. That effort has looked different, and it's kind of ebbed and waned, and it's done better, it's done worse in different eras. But theoretically, I'm not opposed to having some sort of religious gatekeeper, religious translator between the public and the federal bureaucracy, or any government bureaucracy, who just doesn't get religious people.
Yeah. I mean, the question is who, and who does that? And I've had conversations with friends and colleagues in the religious space who, and I had this one conversation with a gentleman, evangelical gentleman, when I was complaining about the appointments at USERF. And at this point, it was all Christians. And he goes, and this is the United States Commission for National Religious Freedom. And he goes, well, Christians are really, I don't have a problem with being all the appointees, all the commissioners being Christian, because they're really the people that are most equipped to advocate for religious freedom. And I go, do you hear the words coming out of your mouth? I go, what does this guy know about Islam? What does this guy know about the nuance? I mean, I'm in my second peer review with my article, maybe the third peer review. And all I can say is I hate my peers. So I could just tell you that right now.
That's supposed to be part of the process, right?
Right.
You're supposed to take your lashings through the gauntlet of peer review.
I mean, I appreciate all the comments, and I appreciate the thoughtfulness and the time people have taken to read. I'm not going to minimize their effort and their time, but oh my God, some of the comments are just vicious. I mean, it's a lashing. Anyways, but in government, I think that there's a difference between religious training, right, and understanding the nuances of religion, and then integrating religion into government. That separation of churches.
Right.
And I would say there's not even a fine line. I would say knowing religion there's plenty of experts in Islam that are not Muslim. Okay. One of my very, very, very close friends and colleagues, Jennifer Bryson, who's at the Hudson Institute, she's a Catholic, and she's an expert in Islam, and you can't, it's very hard. There are very, very few people that can go toe to toe with her. So I think that as subject matter experts can float around, because the criticism is, well, Muslims want to get embedded here, or Baha'is, or somebody wants to get embedded in the government and change it. And that's, I just don't think that's true. I think it's a subject matter just like anything else. And the nuances of each religion within the sects of different religion of each religion is it's so massive that you need multiple subject matter experts from multiple religions going in there and going and unpacking all those pieces. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about someone, an evangelical, who's saying he's never seen it at the pulpit, politics at the pulpit, and I just can't. I go to evangelical churches. It's not like I'm saying I've never been. I go on a semi-regular basis. At least every other month, I'm at an evangelical, and I'm regularly at Christian churches all the time. There's no mosque here in Kingston. There's one maybe down the road, but it's not. And then there's one down in Beacon. Well, it's the same thing with you guys, right? Would you be popping into a Catholic church? There's a nuance. There's cultural communities that go to mosques, and if I go to the masjid up in Albany, it's all Pakistanis. And which is fine. I'm not saying there's anything against Pakistanis, but you walk in and I'm what's Roshni, which anybody who's Pakistani will laugh at that, which means I'm glowing white. So, and right away I don't fit in. I'm a guest. And everyone goes, what is he here? That's the first thing they see. Second, they think, okay, he's FBI. Third, they go, is he converting? That's the other thing. Yeah. Or they say I'm wearing a Sindhi hat, and they go, oh, this poor thing must be lost. He must be, an Afghan. So I think the challenge is that we have a statement, and I think any of this would be fine pre-Trump era, but post-Trump era, we've got pastors, like I said, in the White House. We've got regular podcasts, tweeting and posting of sermons from the pulpit. And unless this guy is under a rock somewhere, and doesn't have any digital media, and is not going to, he's going to just like some of the country bumpkin sort of places that aren't plugged in. I can't see how this guy who's in Washington has not heard any politics from the pulpit. And then I think the other thing is defining what politics are. So if you talk about the sanctity of life, and then you start talking about pelvic politics, you're there now. You're there.
Yeah.
You're influencing. You're taking something in pelvic politics, and you're saying sanctity of life. Then you're getting into abortion, and you're getting to that issue. So I don't even know how you get away from that. And in my tribe, it's there's always something going on where, I'm not going to say on a regular basis. It's been a while since I've been to the masjid, where the sermon is generally in response to news, in response to something that's happening at present day. So, sure. And so are sermons. So there's no way that
Depends
this
on the church.
Right. But, it could be a community-based thing. But a lot of times there's something like, let's just talk about the pandemic. That's become a hyper-political issue. And people are talking about masks and covering yourselves and being safe to others, that whole business, do unto others. And all that has a political overtone right now, even if it's not explicit, it's implicit. And so I think I'm being real nice here on this one, because I don't know. I just don't think, I think it was a flat lie.
Well, so first of all, I take your observation seriously, and I think other Christians ought to too, because you're basing your you have personal experience visiting Christian churches, but on this issue, a lot of what you're seeing is in digital media, social media, the Twitterverse, which we of course recognize is not completely representative of the real world. And
True.
I'm gonna agree. I've heard political sermons in my lifetime in evangelical services. I've rarely have ever heard. It's helpful right now. You said talk about what is political. I like to make sure that we're talking about partisan versus political, right? So you mentioned the sanctity of life issue, right? That's clearly political, quote unquote.
And I did that on purpose. You know what I mean? Like,
I'm not. That's fair. No, it's a good example.
Yeah.
So I'm not like
jumping anti-abortion or pro. I'm just saying like that issue is something that's passionate about your community.
Right. Once you engage any kind of public policy issue, that can be deemed sometimes accurately but also sometimes with an edge of censorship, basically, when it's
Right.
termed political, right? So,
Sure.
and you see this in different places, right? So, if you're sometimes in the pro-life community, if you hear a sermon on, say, abortion, sanctity of human life, the Southern Baptist Convention has issue-based calendars, issue-based Sundays, or they're like emphasis Sundays,
Right.
that have been on the convention calendar for decades now. And one of those is sanctity of life, and it's a Sunday where churches are encouraged to focus on that issue, and maybe deliver a sermon, work on some kind of fundraising, advocacy, support, that kind of thing. Many people would see that
Sunday
as,
sanctity sermon.
yeah, Sanctity of Life Sunday. And it's not a precise Sunday. It's typically around January 22nd, which was the anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Some churches take that and do it on that closest Sunday. Some people move it. It's all a suggestion. A lot of churches don't participate on that. We also have emphasis Sundays for like gambling and racial reconciliation. But all to say, you could take another issue. You could talk about immigration, and some people would say that's political. And on the one hand, it's right because we're talking about public policy, so we're talking about the generic political, right? But you're not necessarily taking in a partisan frame necessarily. A pastor might, but on either issue or on any issue, the best a pastor can do is what we call exposit scripture, preach the meaning of the text, and if the meaning of the text applies
Right.
to a contemporary public policy issue, we welcome that by and large. Some people would call it political. What you see sometimes in Christian churches are people that use that label political to shut down conversation about it, right? And so if you don't want to hear a sermon or a lesson on the sanctity of human life, on the abortion issue, then some people will label that as political in a way that pastors and churches shouldn't touch it because it's political, right? But likewise, if you hear a sermon or a lesson on immigration policy, right, and talking about recognizing human dignity in immigrants, then other people who might be opposed to that particular stance on the issue would label that as a political thing. On the one hand, it's accurate. On the other hand, you have to watch for basically what I think is it's a proxy war that tries to shut down conversation about a contemporary issue. Set all that aside, a third category, which I think is probably what our friend on Twitter was talking about, is during an election season, are you anticipating pastors using sermon time to talk about a current election and trying to influence their congregation to vote? And I am with our friend on Twitter. I think that, number one, it happens. You see it publicly. But I also don't think it's as common as the social media environment tends to portray.
I'm going to take two events, and I'm
Okay.
going to try to marry this in a way in which I would think most of us who are non-evangelical are looking at it. So arguably two of the most pivotal events in the last 20 years would be one, 9/11, two, Trump being elected.
Mm-hmm.
So let's just take those two events. I, as a Muslim, have to answer for and deal with all the results that came out of, all of the dividends that came out of 9/11.
Sure.
And a lot of the jackassery that people say as a result of 9/11. And I mean for my own people. So like I get slammed all the time for what Dr. Syed has said, who's the president of ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, where he said at the podium that we, meaning Muslims, want to change the Constitution.
Right.
And I don't even know
Did he have specifics? Lots of people want to change the Constitution.
Right. So number one, yes, everybody, you can change the Constitution. It's,
Called the
they can
amendment
amend
process.
So that's possible.
You got to get a
But
lot of
that
states
you
to ratify it. It's extremely
right.
difficult.
It's extremely difficult to do it. So one is you can change the Constitution. Two is I understand that, and I have a problem with him saying it because at this point, it's just not the smartest thing to say. Let's just start with that.
You're like,
Okay. Because,
not helping, not helping.
well, look, you can't argue with the history of ISNA and where it comes from. All right. So it has Muslim Brotherhood roots, and those, they may have been quashed or may not have, but the fact is that it's a problem, their history,
Yeah.
and in this post 9/11 world where and I don't even like to talk about Islamophobia because it's not the right term. People actually are scared of Muslims. So
Right.
the challenge is that people talk about Sharia taking over the Constitution, right, and taking over the law of the land, which it's very easy to target 1% of the population and say, let's hammer this 1% of the population. It'll elevate. It'll allow me to
Yeah.
sell books. It'll allow me to position myself correctly. And they're 1% of the population, so they really can't. Their votes don't matter, and they're not really going to come after me. But we do have members of their tribe who are actually creating questionable comments and saying questionable comments and creating a questionable space for Muslims
Yeah.
instead of sort of building bridges, right? And
Yeah.
that's a very political statement. But then, and so we have to answer, I have to answer for all the Muslim stuff. And I'm on the front lines of security in Islam all the time. I mean, that's my business. So the challenge is we've got Trump gets elected, evangelicals elect him. This is a fact. Even if you're a never Trumper, you're probably voting for him. This is because his policies. Well,
I wouldn't go
if
that
you,
far.
well, even if you're never Trumper, you're still benefiting from the policies. And so the policies that you pick to slay him on are calculated very carefully. But you do have active participation of the evangelical community in government to appointed positions. And not only that, it's rammed down all of our throats on a regular basis. It's in the news. It's and I understand your whole thing about the media because we get slammed on the media all the time. But then on top of that, we have a president that is promoting the evangelical narrative, and I know it might be called, what's it called? Prosperity gospel? Is that
Prosperity
it?
gospel.
Prosperity
Yeah.
gospel?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was joking with a friend of mine about how many Bible thumps does it take to win the lotto. And so it may not be pulpit preaching, but it's kind of like pastor pulpit adjacent. Am I right?
So there are at least two ways to look at this, and I think plausibly three. Number one,
I mean, both of our
is
communities have elephants in the room, is what I'm saying.
yeah, sure, that's fair. That's fair.
Events.
So as for the high profile stuff that you see, that pastors are out stumping, politically speaking, in the context of an active electoral process, that happens, and you can see it. And they're typically outspoken on other issues as well, and so you see them do that. I think by and large, given the bulk of Christian churches included, and even evangelical churches, I think that's an outlier. I just think that example, though high profile, and you see plenty of it, I think on the large scale of things, that's rare. Number two, though, I do think, while there are, let's take that example of what I would call a partisan church, right? So a pastor in a church that feels free and unhindered from associating itself with a political party or candidate. Say I would label it in shorthand as a partisan church.
Sure.
It's probably one political party or another. It happens on both sides of the aisle. In the Trump era, you're seeing a higher higher profile versions of Trump supporters in the Republican Party and all that, but it happens on the left too, and has happened in the past. But then there are a lot of churches I think are more numerous than the partisan churches, who most of the time I call silent churches. They're silent on politics, meaning for a number of reasons, the pastor in particular and the church generally doesn't talk about political issues. Now, outliers, they might still engage, say, the pro-life issue from time to time, but by and large, they don't engage politics at all. And on the one hand, the good news for those silent churches is that their membership probably looks more like their local community, politically speaking, right? So you probably have a more balanced mix of Democrats, Republicans worshiping together on a Sunday. But those individuals, my argument is, my theory is that those individuals are not any in themselves, they're not any less partisan than the membership of the partisan church. Why is that? Their pastor's not preaching, they're not endorsing politicians, they're not endorsing political parties, they're, if anything, keeping their mouth zipped closed on political issues. Well, my point is that when you don't hear anything from the church, we leave members of those churches susceptible to political influences from everything other than the church. And so 24/7 news channels, social media,
it's an interesting
family,
it's an
right?
interesting
And so
yeah.
that the vacuum, you know this, that we've talked about these themes before, the vacuum is going to be filled, right? So my political conscience is going to be influenced by something. And if my church is not speaking to it, however it should or ought to, the fact is, if a church doesn't speak to it, I'm getting my political views from everything else. And and everything else I can pick and choose from and craft it myself. And so it's this Western individualism that kind of, that really Western individualism run amok. So I can indulge myself in whatever political issues I want, whatever political theory I want to, and my church is not going to provide any kind of check on me. The way it might on, say, in a personal discipleship in a personal context, more individual Christian living and that kind of sense, right?
Well, I mean, there's the one item that I was going to mention is this article in Religion News Service that says, well, by staying silent, you're actually making a political statement in churches. That's another criticism of the evangelicals. So it's like, there needs to be some consulting between Muslims and evangelicals, because we've been dealing with this maybe a lot longer than you. I mean, Trump has only been around for 3.5 years. So in the last 20 years, Muslims have been forced to figure out where they are politically and forced where they are in the political issues by virtue of like survival of the community in America, particularly.
Which you and I have discussed in the past is I think it's understandable, number one, and number two, short-sighted. But that maybe is a topic for another time.
I think that it was an interesting criticism. I think it's unfair. Again, we were talking about slavery and, churchgoers going during this, before the Civil War, going to church and saying, like, well, I never heard anybody promote slavery at church. Well, it's all around you. Or the Salem witch trials, where you're essentially murdering women because of property rights.
Yeah. Well, the slavery is another good example, actually, because on the one hand, you did have active
the abolitionists, John Brown.
Yeah, but on the
preacher, wasn't he?
Yeah, but on the in the defense of slavery, you have some really heretical scriptural interpretation that perpetuated the thing, number one. And then number two, the whole orbit, again, silent churches who may not have preached pro-slavery, but they did nothing to combat it, right? And so that in and of itself is a problem, and we're still dealing with that today in the current racial context. But particularly, I mean, those are the churches that Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail was addressed to.
We get it all
churches
the time.
that were silent
We get it all the time, because how come there's no comments about Islam, about when there's a terror act, or when there's, in many cases, I'm standing alone. I don't have the sheikhs, I don't have the imams, I don't have them speaking out about what's going on. And in many cases, as soon as somebody flies over and is wheels down in America, they're all about religious freedom and all about multi-faith. But then they go back to their countries and enjoy a reputation of uh, being violent towards any other faith group. Let me put it that way, or advocating for violence. So, we deal with it all the time. I think in our community, where it's there's a nexus of when you're trying to go to a place of worship because you want food for the soul. You're trying to get somebody to say something. My mother would always say this, she goes, I don't know what was set up there, because they're not speaking to me, and I didn't come back with food to inspire me for the rest of the week, right? And so there's I think there's a quality within places of worship for that, and I think that makes sense of why you don't delve into the political issues or don't deal with the issues in front of you. But I would argue that our community since 9/11 is been in peril, and I would also argue that your community since the election of Trump has been in peril. Maybe it's been in peril since the election of John F. Kennedy, and it's a post-Protestant America. I don't know, but
Inside
maybe
jokes,
that's
John. Inside jokes.
so. We'll have to post that article, because I had no idea that exists. So maybe that's
a
the issue.
throwback to an earlier episode a couple seasons ago. So continue.
Yeah, where a journalist argued that that everything pre-Kennedy was Protestant era America, and everything post-Kennedy was, or after Kennedy was a post-Protestant America. So, and we discussed those components. We'll have to put the link in there. So your community is divided, and admittedly, there's the president that's been endorsed by the community has a questionable personal background. And can Christians endorse somebody that has a history like this, who's not really promoting living a Christian life, but not only that, promoting Christian values by example, but is instituting policy that theoretically is going to benefit the community's views on politics. And so I think that's caused a tremendous struggle within the community, and the community is in peril as a result of it. And therefore, comments like this are not helpful, and they make somebody like me, who's looks at somebody like this, who's in charge of media, who's a leader within the community, seem that he's completely out of touch or indifferent to all the changes that are happening around him, which our community is continuously under siege by, that we are oblivious to a lot of the changes that are happening around us, and we don't address them in real time, if we address them at all, as they relate to other faith groups and the West in particular. So, that's kind of where all this stuff came from. But I don't know. Would you agree that your community's in peril as a result of the Trump administration?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by peril. I think if I interpret what you mean correctly, I would say that long term, our community, having embraced Trump the way we have, I say we loosely, the reputation of the evangelical community having embraced Trump, I think is going to brand us in a really unhelpful way for years to come, maybe a generation or two. And I think that's, if you mean in peril in that sense, yes, I agree.
We're all
I think
eyes
it's
are
I
on the
think it's I
evangelical
think it's
community
yeah, I
globally,
think it's
just like the
too
Muslim community.
it's too early to know exactly what that's going to look like. And I hope it's minimal. I hope a lot of people forget this episode of evangelicals and politics, but I'm fearful that it's not, because everything that goes along with Trump, um, is gonna sticks to everything he touches and to everyone that embrace him.
Right.
That's true of Trump in a way that I think has been not as true with previous presidents. Right. And
Right.
it's also true of how the media has treated Trump, which I'm also critical of. There's kind of a symbiotic relationship there. So
I think there is some.
they criticize him, but if he walked outside and said the sky is blue, they would call him a liar, right?
Yeah.
And like it's
But
pretty like
yeah,
he can't things that are actually credible that he has done. Nobody can parse the difference. It's just all bad, all terrible, all the time, and frankly, there's often truth to that. But I think the most vocal anti-Trump folks and people who, particularly in a lot of the prominent mainstream media environments, they're not helping, right? They haven't taken any time in the past 3 to 4 years to understand, by and large, understand why a lot of Americans voted for the guy. Um, they've zeroed in on the most nefarious reasons, much of which is true, um, but there's a lot of reasons there, particularly the economic stuff in the Rust Belt that has very little to do with racism and
right.
really frustration with 8 years of Obama policy,
Yeah.
and it's hard to hold on to the White House for you know for 3 terms. That's a historic anomaly when that
Right.
happens, and so like there's a lot of factors that folks really haven't taken into consideration, and so to lump a lot of Americans, including evangelicals, in with the Trump thing, I think on the one hand is unfair. At the same time, the embrace of Trump by prominent people wearing the evangelical label, we might dispute what it means and what's accurate about that label, but the fact is, high-profile people wearing the evangelical label have embraced him in such a way that I think, yeah, it's going to be detrimental to our movement for quite some time.
Much like our community, who's embraced Muslim Brotherhood and all these other people that we're dealing with. What do you do? What do you do when there's a world leader who's the Hagia Sophia? I lost my campaign on that. I was working, like I said, with Mustafa Akol to try to stop that. Now I'm trying to establish a multi-faith prayer space in the Hagia Sophia.
Yeah.
Okay, in America, there's a lot of churches, but a lot of churches have multi-faith prayer spaces for different faiths.
Yeah.
So why don't we just do that? But I don't know if the Turkish government's going to roll on that one. We'll see. It's a tough deal.
Good luck, my friend.
So yeah, I appreciate the comments, man. I mean, when it comes to this balancing the evangelical community's identity with in the Trump era, how are you gonna? What's your suggestions for a church?
Yeah.
Community-based pastoring, or I'm not sure where you'd go, is going to happen, and that's fine. But when it comes to politics, and when it comes to the responsibility of the community to, and especially somebody like this, a high-profile person, it has to be a little bit more careful, wouldn't you say, about how he is characterizing what is going on within the community when there is such an explicit example of faith in politics, particularly from your particular tribe, and you have to be like, I don't take anything for granted when it comes to speaking about my community with others. I don't assume that you know the difference between an Ahmadi and an Ishmaeli and a Hanbali and a Jafri. I don't assume that you know the differences between that and what's going on within our community. So that has to be explained, which is what this podcast is about. So, I mean, is it, what's your suggestion? One, for the community; two, for when it comes to pastors talking about this type of thing; and three, when it comes to making sort of these national statements, isn't there a responsibility from a leader in the community who's involved in media and how he depicts the community in a way that is genuine and fair And I don't mean fair to pander to his own tribe, because there's a lot of that going on. I'm talking to the rest of us out here who are struggling with trying to balance, for example, religious freedom that's dominated by a Christian worldview, even though there is we're dealing mostly in Muslim countries, and it's difficult. And I'll give you a good example. Miramar is a problem. Government sanctioned killing of Muslims on tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe. I don't know if it's reached the hundreds of thousands. And it's genocide of Muslims. Haven't spoken about that at all in the International Religious Freedom Roundtable. And I've been trying to push the issue. Last week at the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, Evangelical Christian says we got a handful of Christians in the northern Miramar that's being persecuted. We need to focus on the Miramar issue.
Yeah.
And so I am dealing with that, right? Front lines of faith, advocating for all faiths, including Muslims. Yeah. And you have the ridiculousness of a statement like that impacts me, probably speaks to me differently than most people. But, right. And so my thing is suggestions for your community, suggestions for us who are trying to, distill these comments.
Yeah. Well, I'd say there are two themes. My suggestions for a local church are kind of twofold. There's one that's an internal issue, and then there's an outward issue. The internal, the lingo within Christian circles is discipleship, and I'm going to contend that there's an avenue for Christian churches to disciple their members, specifically their what I call political consciences. And so there's a whole orbit of stuff that churches by and large are not doing. Some pastors are doing like a really great job of it periodically, but very few people have like condensed this into a kind of a curated playbook for doing this. One of the internal issues that I really liked seeing pastors do is in the context of what we call corporate prayer on Sunday mornings. It's in the service. They pray when it's done really well. I think they pray for a whole gamut of things. They pray for their local congregation and particular issues inside, whether it's health and healing and marriages and family and local community stuff. Pastors who pray for other churches in the area genuinely, right? Because it downplays a competition, which is usually pretty frequent in Christian circles. And in that context, you also pray about national and worldwide issues. And what's the benefit of that? It doesn't seem like much. It's a prayer. It takes a few minutes on a Sunday morning. The benefit of that is, number one, you're talking, particularly if it's a pastor that's giving the prayer or anybody else, you're using, it's an opportunity to use pastoral language, use scriptural language about how to pray for our nation, about how to pray for our neighbors, about how to pray for people who are far away from us, how to pray for issues around the globe. You're using biblical language in a way that's repetitive every week, like a steady drip, and people are hearing that. And when people are paying attention to that over time, it's like a healthy diet. I think you're gonna see, just one example, you're gonna see people think about contemporary issues in a more biblical way, which is not partisan. And I think that's one example. There are others. There are a lot of examples of what not to do. Don't endorse candidates. Don't endorse political parties. One of the shenanigans we see among some Christian churches is a pastor. We recognize that it's a breach of IRS regulations to endorse a political party or candidate. But a lot of religious leaders
isn't it changed?
No. The White House would like you to believe it's changed. They had a whole campaign, 2 or 3 years ago, that announced that the Johnson Amendment was undone. It's not true. The Johnson Amendment is still in effect. It's just the IRS, as it has done for years, is not enforcing it. And that's the Johnson Amendment's a conversation for another time. But the point is, the institution would get in trouble if a pastor would endorse a candidate, or by law it would be, if laws were really being enforced.
And Cardinal Dolan just got in trouble with that with the Catholic Church. He endorsed Trump. recently, about 3 months ago, and the
Right.
Catholic
And the
Church slammed
IRS,
him pretty hard. Yeah.
right, and the IRS isn't going to touch it.
Yeah.
And what happens? A lot of these past religious leaders will, and I've seen it done in my own circles, will endorse in their personal capacity.
Hmm.
Right, that's how they get around the legal issue. It's
Sure.
they're setting off, legally speaking, their minister nonprofit hat and taking on the role of a private citizen. So I am a private
Ah,
citizen endorsing this candidate, which on the one hand, it skirts the legal issue, but we all know that the whole reason the endorsement is of value anyway is because of that religious leadership.
right.
Political parties value endorsements from people who are influential. And so it's, to me, disingenuous for someone to do that, frankly. Now, I do think it's a breach of free speech for the government to limit that. I think churches and religious leaders ought to make that decision for themselves. But I think it's poor form because candidate endorsement is not. It's in Christian circles. I don't think it's a scriptural thing. It's not something that's an ecclesiastic or something to do with the church. It's not a role of the church. A candidate endorsement is all about a political party. That's a tool of the political party, and it only benefits the
Right.
political party. And a political party, for good or ill, even at its best day, when it agrees with you 100%, has zero obligation for the life of the church. And so I just say stay away from that. So it's equally of what not to do as what to do. On the second thing, I'll be brief. As far as like speaking as a religious leader outside your own congregation, we really have to recognize the translation issue that has to take place. We all think we're speaking the same language because we're speaking English, but it's a real delicate kind of thing to do, to express what a religious people believe about a particular issue to a community that doesn't not only doesn't hold the same values, but doesn't understand those same values. And so you
Right.
have to be able to express yourself in a way that, number one, your own congregation and community does recognize as being accurate to
Hmm.
themselves, but also in a way that translates to others who don't share your values. And it can be done at its best. That's what pastors in the public square can do, and there's some that are really good at it. But a lot of times, because of our silence for so long on so many issues, most
Yeah.
people don't have that muscle developed in a way that they're ready to, when an issue finally flares up enough and they want to say something publicly. Most in our community haven't really developed that kind of linguistic muscle to, to use a convoluted phrase, right? And so they often get themselves in trouble, either angry from the community outside the church, or the church doesn't think they've been accurately represented. And so yet another problem when churches have taken a silent position, because eventually some issue is going to be uh, it's going to flare up enough, either in the pastor as a person or a community, that people get angry enough to finally want to do something about it. And unless you've had developed habits over the long term, you're kind of out on a limb when you do that.
Well, and a lot of times it's reactionary to things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's something happens here, so something
Yeah.
the burning of Qurans, for example, in Florida or something. All these different things can become hot button issues, and then the reactionary quality of it makes a political statement that has ramifications, and if they don't have the muscle like you're talking about, it can affect the community, all communities on all sides. So
Yep.
I mean, I appreciate you chatting with this. I know you were a little
Likewise.
nervous. You thought I was gonna, get
I'm
crazy,
never
but
nervous with you.
yeah, well, you've got my number. We got each other's
Okay,
number.
I'm
So
a little more nervous when we're not doing editing.
a little,
I can't cut you out.
like I'm pretty mellow. So
No, you're cool.
should I give
This
you
is a worthwhile
congratulations?
conversation.
Should I give
Yeah,
you
you can if you want. Yeah,
congratulations?
sure.
I mean, you're a professor now, right?
Instructor, adjunct
Instructor. Okay.
part-time faculty.
All right.
I'm going to teaching intro to world religions at a local community college here
All
this
right.
fall
All right.
to
Let's
supplement
do it.
my doctoral studies. So I'm pretty pumped about that. It'll be my
That's
first
exciting.
formal teaching role. So I got a syllabus I got to put together and a big, thick intro to world religions book that I gotta read through.
Okay, well, let me know if you need help. I'm happy to
Yeah,
help you. And we've got
maybe I'll bring you in on the Islam unit as a special guest speaker.
faith in action. We can do something. So here's a we got a huge speaker list coming. So I know that our publicist is working hard on that, and we're always looking for sponsorship, right? So
Yes,
you have a coffee cup. We
I
want
do.
we need
My favorite coffee shop from Capitol Hill. My Capitol Hill neighbors will recognize this as Ebenezer's Coffee Shop over by
yeah,
Union Station. I
yeah,
understand that part of town's a ghost town right now during the pandemic, which is really sad. But this
and
is
they
one
need
of
to
my
sell coffee.
my few keepsakes that I had to take and buy before I left DC a couple
I
years
was
ago.
about to say, if it just froze
Sorry,
out.
it just froze out. All right, that's good. We got to wrap anyway.
Yeah, I was just saying, you
We good?
always steal something when you leave before you leave your office. You stole the
Right.
Ebenezer coffee cup.
I did not
Um,
steal it, John. I
so,
purchased it from the Ebenezer's Coffee
okay,
House.
as far as we know. So, anyways, I appreciate taking the time and unpacking this a little bit. We'll post some articles, and like I said, we're looking for sponsors for the podcast. And we'd like to. We're working on our speaker list, and we've got really a good 6 months of banking out appointments with some
Yep.
high level speakers from both of our
And
Rolodexes.
And look, if you're joining us for the first time on YouTube, visit our website at crossingfades.com to get a sense of our program. And you can go back to, I'll post the pilot episode in the show notes here.
Okay.
That'll give you a sense of what this program's about. And we'd welcome your subscription to the audio download, the audio version of this podcast. We'd greatly appreciate it wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Overcast, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, and now YouTube. This has been Crossing Fades with John Pinna and Matt Hawkins, podcast of Roll Top Productions and Muslims for Muslims. See you next time,
Sir.
John.
All right, so long.